So it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to this visitor talk and research integrated teaching organized by the Faculty of Graduate Studies and the Office of Research. We are honored to have with us a distinguished guest speaker, Professor Stefan Suring. I thank you for being part of being with us and sharing your insights with us today. But before we proceed, I would like to invite Dr. Janisu Singh from the Department of Transport Management and Logistic Engineering to introduce us.
So thank you very much. So it's a great privilege to introduce Professor Dr. Stefan Suring. So Stefan, just giving you a heads up early at hand, this will be a little lengthy, but still, I think this must be done. So Professor Dr. Stefan Suring is a distinguished German professor specializing in supply chain management with a particular focus on sustainability and supply chains. And since 2011, he has held the position of full professor as the chair of supply chain management at the University of Kassel, Germany. He completed his doctoral and postdoctoral studies at the University of Oldenburg, Germany. Prior to that, he completed 2 master's degrees as well. He has a Master of Science in Chemistry from University of Bristol, UK, and a Master of Science Business in the Environment from the University of Kent at Canterbury, UK. So Professor Suring is an internationally recognized person for his pioneering research at the intersection of supply chains and sustainability. His work encompasses sustainable supply chain management, supply chain strategy, digitization, and circular economy. He has been involved in interdisciplinary research projects, collaborating with experts from agriculture, engineering, and political sciences. His research has addressed topics such as decent work, biodiversity, and business strategies for the base of the pyramid contexts, including conducting some empirical studies in countries such as India, Pakistan, Kenya, Uganda, Brazil, and Chile. Professor Suring's scholarly output includes numerous articles in esteemed journals, to name a few: International Journal of Operations and Production Management, International Journal of Production Economics, Supply Chain Management and International Journal, Journal of Business Ethics, and of course, Journal of Cleaner Production. And his publications have garnered significant citations reflecting their impact on the academic community, notably an article co-authored by Professor Suring and Professor Martin Mueller has received over 8,600 citations, underscoring its influence in the field. And in recognition of his influential research, Professor Suring was listed among the 27 globally most influential researchers in logistics and supply chain management by a panel of French researchers in 2016. And the Web of Science and Clarivate Analytics listed him as a highly cited researcher for 7 consecutive years since 2018, for Crossfield in 2018, 2019, 2021, 2022, 2023, and 2024, and 2019 and 2020 for economics and business. Apart from all those things, what I think quite prominent for his career as an academic is he has demonstrated strong commitment to teaching and especially mentorship. So he has successfully supervised more than 30 PhD students, fostering the next generation of scholars in supply chains and sustainability. His dedication to education is evident in his active involvement in curriculum development and his efforts to integrate contemporary research findings into his teachings. That's why we are here today, focusing on the research-based teaching. So welcome, Stefan, second time to the university. And this time, we are very honored to have him as an honorary professor at the Department of Transport Management and Logistics Engineering, University of Morocco. Over to you, Stefan.
Many thanks, Jane. That puts quite the bar quite high, yeah. And I'll try to do my best to deliver to all what you promised already. Yeah, it's a great pleasure being here, and I brought you a bit of a talk. I think I would need roughly almost 1 hour, and I'll cover research-based teaching, because I think this is one of, at one of the central points of what universities, and particular research active universities, have to almost do. Yeah, this is part of our impact on society. And allow me to look back a little, and that's even looking beyond far my personal history, as well as even the University of Kassel, which is a comparatively younger institution, only a good 50 years old. But if you look at humanity by now, then you would see that some of the universities that we have are now among the oldest continuously working institutions of humanity. Yeah, some of the reigning houses of kingdoms can also be centuries old. But if you look at it, then even countries have changed so often. The name of countries has changed so often. The borders have changed so often. Yeah, there's bizarre stories, and let me just mention one particular one. The oldest Swedish university is called the University of Greifswald, which by now is a German university, but it is still a university. It's still the same university. Yeah, so even the changing reign of land has, in many cases, kept the universities in place. Now that brings me to the question: what are universities about? What is the core of what we do? And I typically sum this up in just 2 words. Yeah, and it should work. Oh, that is just, it's the typical thing, given up. Yeah, and I'm in this already. And I typically sum this up once more in just 2 words, which is just theory and method. Theory you can equate with the point of, what questions do I have to ask? And this is irrespective of whether we talk of a university, or whether we talk of a company, or whether we talk of a country. What questions do we have to ask that drive our institution, our society, our scientific system forward? And method then equips you with the tools of finding answers to these questions. And this is what, no more and no less, but obviously, and I would have a very strong argument on this, in the last couple of 100 years, and we can typically look at a couple of really 100 years now, universities have been at the forefront of doing this and really doing theory and method. Now let's quickly, before we delve then into the other things, I quickly want to have a quick look at the terminology. You can certainly do this differently and have a different take on this, but I always like the saying, which is attributed to quite some people over the centuries even: nothing is quite so practical as a good theory. Yeah. And the other point, and I sometimes scare students in the very first lecture of their first year. I scare them with, I'm explaining them the term theory, particularly to make them not scared and not afraid of it. And terminology here is very simple, and I take it from a paper which you'll find in the references here, Wacker 1998. It's first of all, about the definitions of variables. And if you look at how you start a lecture, and I guess that also holds for you when you start a lecture, you typically, the first thing that you do is you explain terminology. What are we talking about? The second one is a bit more tricky. This is called here limiting the domain. So where are the boundaries on where theory applies and where theory not applies? And here I always have a tricky example, or a strange example. Yeah, Gary S. Becker received, I hope I have the year right in mind, the Nobel Prize for Economics in 2007. Now, if you look at the work of Gary S. Becker, then it's particularly about what is typical for economics, a so-called utility function, like what do you get out of doing something? Now, if you just tweak it a tiny bit, then you can use Becker's work also for explaining whether getting married has a utility function or not. Yeah? When you got married, did you look at it as from the perspective of a utility function? Yeah, a strange observation from German statistics, just as an anecdote. Yeah, if men get married, then they gain 8 years of life expectancy. That's what the German statistics say. I did not mock this up. Yeah, as soon as they get divorced, they lose it. Yeah, what is it like for women? It's absolutely irrelevant. Yeah, make up your own mind on this point. Yeah, but the point is, So is getting married now a typical issue that we explain in business or economics? You can question this, I don't mind. Yeah? And once more, I'm just using this as an example, still related to a Nobel Prize, on is this relevant? Is this something that we should explain? Is this something that we should not explain? Yeah. Next point, you could also say variables and interrelations. And if you, whenever you look at it, and I think particularly in engineering, that's very strong, you have causalities. If I want to build a building, the walls to stand strong have to be so and so much. I have to have so and so much iron. You can calculate this. If you have a vehicle driving, you have to look at all the dynamics of the movement. You have to see on how much, let's say an electric car, how much energy intake do I have in the battery, then I can predict on how far I would be going with the car. Very simple. Yeah, and that already leads to the last points. Theories are typically about making predictions. I just used the example, if I have a battery of that size, then typically the laptop runs so and so long, the car goes so and so far, these kind of things. And that's then linking it to the next point already. I look for empirical support. Like staying with the picture of the car, I can actually test it, I can drive it, and then I see what mileage I get out of it. Very, very simple. Yeah. Now to pair this up, here we have the terminology for theory. Now here's also the terminology for a very wide empirical research process. It's taken from a paper on the case study process, which some social scientists use, but I would say the very generic steps that you have here, they would also hold in an engineering environment as much at the same. Yeah. So you first have to define the research question. What do I basically want to look at? Then you have to look at what is called here instrument development and whether this is like setting up a survey design, like a questionnaire where you ask 100 or 1,000 people, or whether you create an experiment where you test the reliability of a certain product, where you test steel until it breaks or something like this. Is at the end all the same. At least the steps are very generic. Then you do the data gathering, data collection, you go to the field, or you go to the lab and you run the experiment. Can also be an economics or psychological experiment, just to draw it very wide. But once more, it also holds for engineering. Then you analyze the data, you use statistics, you use interpretive methods, you use, in our case, for example, content analysis and these kind of things. And then you do disseminate, you try to make sense of all of this. Yeah. So once more, a very generic things. And we see that, and that's why I used these two slides here, that both the terminology that I introduced for theory as well as the one that I use for empirical research in a very wide sense, this is well beyond a single scientific domain. It's not bound to what we just have in management or in engineering, but it's basically connecting us. And it is also showing that universities have a joint ground to work on. That's the particular point. Let's now go a bit more into what the talk is supposed to be about, and I'll make then some other points. Research-based teaching, connection between teaching and research. And if you are at research-intensive universities, as this is typically called in the UK, and even further, if you want to integrate this then into your own teaching, then you basically have to be research active, as they call it. Yeah, and I see a point, and that the phrase, the wording was actually coined by what is called the Russell Group universities in the United Kingdom. They always say it's a difference on whether you study with somebody that teaches the research of others, or whether you study that teaches the research that they have done themselves. And I think that's typically something that also students quickly get. Yeah. Do I talk to people that report first-hand knowledge that they have even created and disseminated in the global research community? Or do I just talk of other? Of course, in my own teaching, I also use the research of others. That's absolutely fair enough. It's not saying that everything that we do would rely on this. That's I would say, then exaggerating. But it's still having this in mind. I tried to point out why I see this as relevant for higher education and student development already. Most of the things that I illustrate also in what we are doing is rather geared towards master students, which in our case also has to do with the sheer number of how many students we have. Yeah, And for bachelor students, I always feel a bit sorry, but it's the same than when I was doing it. You first need to have basically some basic concepts, some terminology in place in many subjects, and whether this is chemistry or whether this is business administration, so that's at least two topics that I can talk about. Without precise terminology, you hardly can talk to each other. So that's why we need a language of science to basically do so. I want to look a bit at related concepts and some benefits for these kind of issues. I still introduce another term before we go more to the research-based one. I want to also introduce the term of research-led teaching. Here's terminology for both of them. Focus on delivering existing research findings, whereas research-based teaching actively involves students into the process. Yeah, and that's where you then have this one. So the main difference is the active involvement of the students into the process. Now I will develop one more point, and then I'll also take the opportunity to go a bit into, and I share this with Jayeni, our field of supply chain management, and with the colleagues from the department to illustrate some more of the research that I was involved in. But here's one more slide. And that's also that's summing up some of the things now. So we have theory, we have method, and the third point is then what I call the empirical field. And again, I would say it's irrelevant or irrespective of whether this is economics or engineering. It's basically what are you really interacting with. And a typical point that I see, that's why I included this slide, is that first of all, don't mix up the empirical field on being the theory. The empirical field is, let's say, textile production in Sri Lanka. It's automotive production in Germany. It is, what did we look at? Soybean production in Brazil, just to give you some examples. Yeah, and it's not better or worse on whether this takes place in Chile and South America, or in Indonesia, in the Indian and Pacific Ocean, or in Norway, in the cold part of Europe or something like this. That's all I would say equally good. But you have to have an argument on how the theory that you use, the method that you apply, and the empirical field that you look at, how they interrelate. And this is where you really create strong research questions. And this is when you get one right, never mind. When you get two right, okay-ish. But the really good research comes from the overlap of these three circles. That's why I deliberately include this here. Yeah? I forgot to add a reference, but I think that's not too decisive in this case. Because then you get to things where really the interplay of these three components of crafting research makes a difference in driving it forward. And this is where you then have the opportunity to contribute again to the body of knowledge that we have. Research-led teaching, as said, more converting recent research into teaching. Non-research intensive institutions, this is usually what they predominantly do. Yeah. While typically it should build on own research, and a typical thing that we do in our teaching, and I deliberately say we as the wider team, it's not always only me. We look at what papers did we recently publish that might make sense to be integrated into our teaching. Now, we're using rather an example which is a bit more generic and a bit older. Jayeni basically bypassed it. Let me sorry, now I'm looking for a slide. Sorry, that's where I have to change the slide setup, sorry. You see it's numbered as slide set 17. It's a shortened version of what I really just do in my master's. So you see it's deliberately a slide set that I use in my normal teaching of the class. It's basically referring to a paper that Jayeni more or less mentioned already. Yeah, it's I have to go back in here again. It's building on, let me switch the sequence a little. It's building on a paper that we already published in 2008. And therefore we used it for quite some time in our teaching already. Let me start with a bit of a wider motivation, particularly for the people that are not so much the supply chainers here. Yeah. I guess almost all of us own a pair of denim jeans. It's almost, I would say, for a global citizen nowadays, almost unavoidable. Yeah. As Sri Lankan students would typically know that this is made of cotton. German students sometimes are not so sure what it's actually made of. Yeah. And yeah, because you live in a different environment, and textile and apparel fashion is far more relevant as an industrial production in Sri Lanka than it is in Germany. In Germany, we have a bit of what is called in technical textiles. Yeah, for cars, like your seatbelt is also a textile. Yeah, so just to cover, but here we in particular rather look at apparel thing. We typically start here with cotton production. That can be, so we have here cotton production. Then that could be in different parts of the world. We know that Mexico, China, United States, India, but also quite a number of countries in Africa, as well as in South America, Peru, they all produce cotton. Yeah, it's really a kind of a global produce. Then we, let me bypass already what we then have on the next slide. Cotton is then also an issue that is a bit complicated. This is an image taken from Wikipedia, and it's showing the Lake Aral at the border of, you see here, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and you see, and that's basically roughly my lifespan, how the lake is basically drying up. It's a couple of thousand square kilometers originally, and just cotton production, just cotton supply chains and our use of cotton. And let me be careful, I'm not blaming a single person, but all of us together collectively actually do so. Yeah? Have led to this because the water originally coming from rivers from the north and from the south is now diverted for irrigation of cotton fields. Very simple. Yeah, it's one of the examples. If we return to the other things and look at other environmental issues, maybe one more fact on cotton production. Cotton production accounts for roughly about 3% of all agricultural fields globally, but it uses roughly 15% of the global annual pesticide production. I repeat the figures, 3% of acreage, 15% of pesticide usage. Yeah? This is both an environmental issue, because this is in the environment and in the local environments. It is even a social issue, because when the people go to the fields and harvest the cotton, they are then exposed to the residues of these pesticides. And I'm again being careful to ban absolutely all pesticide usage globally for agriculture. That would not work. I just don't see it. There is a movement of organic agriculture, which has its stake, and we can certainly do more, and we can monitor it much better. And it's even a wise decision, because if you apply less, you save money because it's expensive. But banning everything tomorrow would not do the job. Then people around the globe would have more hunger issues and other issues. Let's just be careful. So I'm just trying to point to there are some of these issues along our supply chains. Now going a bit deeper into the supply chain, then we have the thread production. Here it says China, could be Turkey, an important player also in the market. Then we get to the basically, thereby we get to the fiber. From the fiber that is typically called to be one-dimensional, we go to the fabric. The fabric is then two-dimensional. Yeah, again, could be done in China, could be done in Turkey, Taiwan. I guess by now would also be done in Pakistan. Definitely something of these things going on in Sri Lanka. Yeah, and then from the fabric, you basically go to the production of the jeans, and the jeans or any kind of apparel product then is typically called to be three-dimensional. So we go from 1 to 2 to 3 dimensions in our production of the good. Yeah, just as an illustrative example. And then we go into shipping these things around. In the German children's TV a couple of years ago, there was an example of cotton being planted in Texas, then the yarn being produced in Turkey, the fabric being done in China, the apparel being sewn, I think, in Indonesia, and then it finally was sold in Europe. So a typical apparel product can have had its journey around the globe. the globe already, even before it lands and ends up in our body. Yeah. So just to give you an idea of a supply chain. So what are supply chains typically about? We definitely have the material flow. That's what I emphasized with the cotton. We also have the information flow. The information flow is typically preceding the material flow. And we quite often we spare it a little, but it plays a role. We have also the financial flow, because of course then the material is flowing the one direction, information usually bidirectional, and the money then the other direction to the material, which is fair enough, because also the farmers in the cotton fields and the workers in the cotton fields want to get paid, hopefully be paid a decent wage, which satisfies their day-to-day needs, and this kind of things. Another issue that could be addressed here, as much as all of the things along textile and apparel production, where we have a lot of the social issues. We have issues with working hours. We have access to fresh water, to toilets. We have the right to form unions, and all of the social issues abundant in the supply chain. That's why I basically relate to it, because we see both the economic benefits that we get out of it as consumers, as producers, but we also see all of the environmental and the social issues, and therefore we are amidst the sustainability topic. That's basically where I wanted to quickly take you. Now let's take a brief look at this one. And here's a bit of research context, which in now research-led teaching, I would only cover very quickly. There we don't look at the method so deep, but it's based on just what we now call a literature review, and analyzing other papers and doing it. And what I was, let's now be honest, when we started to do this in 2004, I was not aware of where it would take us. I was not aware of that this would keep me busy and in the career for my next 20 years. Yeah. And I was certainly not aware that this would become a seminal paper in the field, by no means. Let's just be honest. For those that are a bit more into business thinking, this is the idea of, is this a planned strategy or an emergent strategy? We had a bit of a plan to do something for this, fair enough. Yeah, and we also saw, and now comes the point which I think we did quite well, while most people still were talking of green supply chains, we were deliberately saying we have to talk of sustainable supply chains. We also need to have the social issues integrated, and not only the environmental. That's what I deliberately would say so, and that should basically be the issue and these kind of things. Here's a bit of the delimitations described. So we don't look at ethical issues. We don't look at reverse logistics and remanufacturing. Not saying this is not relevant, that are topic in their own right, but saying we have to limit it somehow to keep a focus. Yeah, theory, method, field, being aware of the boundaries that you have to address. So all of the inclusion criteria, which I briefly mentioned, we then, and that was a bit surprising to us, while the topic has been around for some time, we basically did not find a decent definition in the field, and that's why we actually included one in the paper. And that's always something that I would say, when you see this, then do so. It's also not really surprising. The first part is basically copies of previous definitions of supply chain management. For those a bit more familiar with the topic, you would always know Menzer et al. Journal of Business Logistics 2001. Yeah, defining supply chain management is the simple title of the paper, and that's what you can also see here. And then we added basically the 3 dimensions of sustainability, which again is not too surprising, but we at least had a clever idea to do both of it at the same time. Yeah. Then we looked at some more particular issues. So we emphasized what is called the triple bottom line approach, or people, planet, profit. So you care for the people that you have working in your supply chain and so on. You care for the planet and try to avoid environmental issues. And then you also still need to have some profits. I'm still a proponent of market-driven economies because we saw, and I grew up to what then was called the Iron Curtain, really close to it in Germany. Yeah, and we saw that the planned economies of East Germany and other parts of the world, they failed people as well. as much as the environment. So that's not a solution. Yeah? So we have to balance these kind of things. We look then at some phases of the supply chain. This is some of the issues which I would rather cut a bit short here and quickly go to some things. You see that I here integrate and blend in also some further research by others. I here in DSA a couple of years later then have put some key characteristics of sustainable supply chains together. You see the already mentioned flow of material, services, information. We see the coordination with organizations and between organizations. We see a stakeholder focus, so taking a wide range of people involved in these supply chains into account. Customers as well as consumers, as well as suppliers and even governments. We have the relationship focus inside the network with internal and external relationships. I just mentioned that we still need some decent profits and therefore value creation, both for the customer as well as for the producer. Then an efficiency focus in line with keeping an eye on your economic situation, and therefore also the performance focus, just to shortly sum this up. We see that this is then balanced with some sustainability issues. The first three are the obvious ones mentioned already: economic, environmental, social issues. The stakeholder focus actually has an overlap among both the more business-driven as well as the more sustainability-driven side. Still the issue of the voluntary nature of business sustainability. This is now a big debate on how much regulation do we need. The European Union at the moment saying we need more regulation towards sustainability. The United States, let's say, at least the president, not all of the country, saying, boy, this is bad. Yeah, make up your mind. We'll see. And let me honestly say, I'm a continental European. I still think we need some regulation, and the market alone will not just do it. But it's on the other hand side, once more, I don't want to have socialistic systems. So it's a tight balance that you have to keep in what do you regulate and where you keep the market forces at play. So it's delicate. It's not simple, and I don't want to sell simple solutions here. Resilience, that's what we latest learned. All of us had to learn in a dramatic manner in the times of COVID-19, which all of you will remember. Yeah, how do we keep our systems going with external shocks or black swan events, as this is called, and then also the long-term nature of sustainability, end-of-life management, reuse, all of the circular economy issues, and such things that also relate to it, just to show. Now back to what we already did in 2008. And I still would see that the lines of argument still hold, otherwise I would not use them still in teaching. If I would have seen something that is dramatically better, then I'm also very happy to replace my own work and use the ones of others. Yeah, you saw that I just used another paper already. So we have governments, consumers, and stakeholders basically driving what is here called the focal company. Let me bypass the term of the focal company that we use in supply chain management a lot, but also in other parts of management. It's typically a company that is visible to the end customer. Yeah, you have a Samsung or an Apple or a Xiaomi or whatever smartphone. You do not talk of the dealer where you bought it. The same for your car. Yeah, for furniture, it's usually a bit tricky. For apparel, somewhere in between. We have some branded things and we have some other things. Yeah, but particularly the branded things, once more, the visibility of the company to the end customer, that's a strong point. Yeah, and I can stay now with the electronics, and Apple is always a very nice example for this, because how much does Apple actually produce? Do you know? How much is Apple really producing? Hardware. Basically nothing. Just nothing. And still we see them as the brand owning company, and they fulfill the criteria of the focal company, which I'm now enriching by 2 more points. They design the product. This is exclusively Apple. And they manage the supply chain. So visibility to the end customer, designing and responsibility of the product, and managing the supply chain. And this is what Apple does. Even if they buy the panels, the screens at Samsung, for example, yeah, they still manage the supply chain. Samsung does as well. So that's also a nice example that companies can be suppliers and competitors of products at the same time. And those two definitely are for multiple years. Anecdotally, a couple of years ago in Europe, they were fighting wars with each other on the design of tablets. And both of them were blaming the other side that the tablet looked too much like the other one. At this time, the tablet displays of the iPads came from Samsung. And I always had the feeling, why the hell do they do this? Because it's cheap merchandising, it's cheap advertising. All newspapers reported on it, and they didn't have to pay. It was even in the news channels. Yeah, I thought my impression was this is much more why they actually did this, was far more advertising than really having lawsuits with each other. That was completely useless. Now let me, after so many years in the job, I'm also allowed to say, I think one of the clever things is actually that we already wrote in Multi-Tier Supply Chain 2008. 2008, that was not a stream of research. 2025, it is a very much a live stream of research. There's many contributions. I had another PhD student that had also contributed to this one. Yeah. And already writing this in, honestly, I think that was just a feeling that we have to. And not that we really had an idea to also be reflective on this kind of things, not the full idea on board, this will be a stream of its own right of research. No, let's just, again, be honest. Huh? On the other two, I'll shortcut this a little. We have supplier evaluation for risk and performance. And let me shortcut some of the things here, because I just want to give you a bit of a flavor on what's basically in there. So the risk and performance issue, and this slide, I would basically call the conceptual blueprint of what we now see in supply chain due diligence regulation. Because supply chain due diligence regulation emphasizes that you make sure in your supply chain you avoid environmental and social risk. And here we go. Yeah, once more. The German supply chain due diligence law was passed in 2023, and we wrote this in 2008. And again, I have to admit, I did not know that it was quite a clever move. Yeah, it's just and I obviously I had not in mind that there would later on be supply chain due diligence legislation. Yeah, that was not my intention. And I did not write the law or something like this, but we contributed to the building up the knowledge. Yeah, and why this? I think I motivated this already. If we look at all the environmental and social issues that we have in the supply chains, then basically this is what we want to look at. And it is fair enough that the worker in Sri Lanka, as much as the worker in Germany, can and should earn what is called a decent wage that covers basically their life expenses. If you work full time, then you basically should be able to live a somehow at least decent life, not starving, being able to afford the mobility that you need, having decent working hours, being able to feed your family. These kind of things. Yeah. Just pointing to some other things. Of course, we have also the issue of economic risk and disruption. Yeah, I mentioned COVID already. I could mention the simpler things like the Evergreen being stuck in the Suez Canal. I think you have also heard of all of these kind of things. There were then, at the end, there were 400 ships waiting at both sides of the Suez Canal for the passage because of just 6 days of blockage. Yeah, because our global supply chains, global logistics is so connected that the ships from China to Europe and US and back, they move on the schedule that is more predictable or as predictable as the underground in London. Don't underestimate this. And if you block it for 6 days, that takes weeks to be resolved again. Yeah, just as one thing. Quickly looking at the performance side, we definitely have trade-offs. And the strongest I would even quickly see on the social side, if I pay worker a couple of dollars, euros, rupees, whatever more, yeah, they are not immediately more productive. Particularly for people at the minimum wage, they don't turn more productive because you pay them a bit more decently. Absolutely no. The same for us. If we get paid another share of money, do we churn out 3 more papers because you get something more? No. Do you supervise more master students because you don't? No, but that's very, yeah, it's very critical because it holds fast as well. And I'm comparatively globally well paid to be, I'm allowed to say. Yeah. I will not turn more productive if you pay me better. Of course, I like more. That's very simple. I'm still a human being. Yeah. Win-win situations, I think the easiest are to be found really at the intersection, and I bypassed this already, of environmental and economic issues. If I use less pesticides, I have to pay less for the pesticides. And we know that in many fields, in many cases, there's an over-application. So it's really cheaper to use less, still being effective, still having the same economic utility, production, productivity measures, and then it's just cheaper doing it. The same with any kind of waste minimization. Waste minimization is typically always an economic, environmental intersection win-win situation. Yeah. The minimum requirements, I think I mentioned by now. You see that we have a bit of overlap here because we then now also look at the supplier evaluation, what kind of suppliers do I use? I have to communicate the environmental and social issues as criteria. I use what is called supplier self-evaluation. This is pretty standard in many industries by now. Already in the mid-2000s, Volkswagen used this for their suppliers. So before, if let's say a new company wants to become a supplier of Volkswagen, I'm allowed to use this case here now, then they could just go to the Volkswagen website for wastesupply.group.com. They could register themselves, and then they would have to provide many pieces of information themselves before Volkswagen would ever consider taking them in as a supplier. Yeah? And again, the environmental and social standards, I think I mentioned here already on this side. Let me then last look at on the product side. We also want to have environmental, or we have environmental concerns of our products. Look at all the digital toys that we use. I have here a full set available at the moment, a laptop, a smartphone, a digital pen, and a presenter. Yeah, and they are produced typically in China now. Yeah? Then we use them, and then they end up being waste and these kind of things. And we also have to consider these things. If you go to Accra, Ghana, and see where, and partly also in India, where all the electronic waste ends up, it's a complete nightmare. So that's where we have to look at a more circular economy. We have to look at resource utilization, and that's where then typically life cycle assessment arguments come in. And again, we need the related communication among the company and the supply chains. And by now I would even include the reverse supply chain, which you do not really see in here. We need to have the communication of related criteria, and we need to try to look at further managing the suppliers. Let me end here with this example. It was just a brief sketch on, once more, in the 2000s, 20 years ago, that was initial research. And now it's basically part of my standard teaching that I do in my master class every year. Yeah, research-led teaching, to come back to this point. So here we are. Now I need to get this correct. It should be this slide set. Promoting critical thinking and scientific methods. Now I move from research-led to more research-based teaching. Research-based teaching, once more, the active engagement of students as researchers. And interestingly, in my personal development, as well as in the development that we had in the team, we rather turned to this in times of Corona. Beforehand, we were rather teaching the research methods class in teaching every single method. This is a case study, this is a survey design, this is what you do in survey design, this is a Delphi study, and some others. Yeah, but that's somehow boring. And even how the hell do you examine this? Huh? And I was unhappy because now we did not even have personal contact with the students. Everything had to be online, and I thought we have to do it differently. And actually then I even more came up with the idea of we have to integrate the students into the research process, and therefore also change the interaction that we have with the students. The compromise is that the students typically learn only one method. The gain is that they really get to know all the complications of the method. And once they know one method, then having understood the total process, and I showed you these 5 steps, that's for me by now far more important than whether they know some basic things on survey design but have never applied it. Yeah, so that's basically the kind of the the logic that we followed here. Learning and teaching theories. Now, this is basically inherently built in, because when we now, and I'll also show you an illustrative example here in a couple of minutes, basically we really link the students into our research, which also means they have to dig deeper into the theory side. That's what we also explored partly in some essays. I'm not sure how this is done here. But typically, if you just have students write on any point on supply chain risk, on supply chain resilience, on mass customization, on even on product design and engineering or something like this, by now, I would say latest in the last 2 years now, this is taken over by ChatGPT. Forget about it. Yeah, standard topics that the AI will do, and the learning for the students will be marginal because they will use the AI tools, and you have to then detect on, is this actually written by an AI tool or is it actually written by a human being? So from my personal feeling, this kind of standard things, because that's what I quite hear from colleagues in other international settings, that they have students write on standard topics. Forget about it. AI will do it. Go to ChatGPT, you type in, I want 3,000 words on supply chain risk. You get 3,000 words on supply chain risk. You have to correct some sentences because the sentences are not complex enough, and too much of it is just bullet point after bullet point after bullet point. But the clever student will correct this. They will also correct the messed up references that the AI tools typically generate, and they will still be done within 1 day where they are supposed to need a week. Unrealistic? I think that's it. Yeah, that is what will hit us. And therefore, we have to create other methods anyway. And this is one where I think, I hope, let's see, in the couple of next years, that we are so specific that, and the topics are so specific that the AI would just get you better nonsense. I might be wrong. Let me be very careful here. It's still a more constructivist approach, which I'm not going too much into now. But learning through research and importance of self-regulation, responsibility in the learning process. Therefore, then that is what we have. And a standard essay, what I just outlined, would not have all of these kind of things. That's basically the points. We use research projects as part of the teaching. Once I return from Sri Lanka, we'll basically have to prepare. We are in a bit of a different timely logic than other countries in Europe. So we'll only start our summer term mid of April. And therefore, second half of March is then always the time where we look at what are we currently doing in our research and what topics would we want to work on in the next couple of months together with students. And let me also emphasize another point that is somewhere later in the slides. This is also for me one of the tools where I do what I would call risky research. And as research-driven institutions, we have to be willing to do risky research. Risky research might be research where at the end we identify or the total research question is just nonsense. Yeah, do you do so? Do you allow yourself the freedom, the academic, I would say even required freedom of spending time on things which are so novel that you do not know what you would get out? I love this, believe me. I love it. Yeah. I always tell the students, you will write something, you will get your mark, you will get your credits, you will go on in your classes, in your program, and I take the risk of the research question being really nonsense. But where should we challenge us? Yeah, a PhD student, let me blend this in quickly. A PhD student typically has to have something positive after 3-4 years. A PhD student just writing this didn't work and that didn't work and this is nonsense. I also did not find anything here. Wow. Then even keeping the motivation for 4 years, how would you keep this person going? So for the PhD student, you have to limit the risk somewhere. You still have to have forward-looking topics. The topic that you start on to work with a PhD student has to still be publishable in 5 years. If it is not relevant in 5 years, on my personal side, it is not worth a PhD because that's the time it takes. Or are you PhD students done in 6 months? Yeah. So you have to be really forward-looking. And master students for me, and that's maybe where we are, you could call some, I think another colleague somewhere internationally even called it a bit cruel. On the other side, some other colleagues also said, boy, you are really in a luxury situation that you can just do whatever you want to. Yep, right. That's really great. And I know and I respect this, and I like it a lot about my job. Yeah. But once more, we have to try to move beyond this kind of thing. So sometimes, once more, we would just use ongoing PhD thesis research and relate a student to it and help the PhD student in data collection, help them in data analysis, help them in coding, help them in all the phases of research project that you have. Yeah, and typically that's very good, because even if we work on literature or if we work on interviews, then we can have, we even later on in the paper can write, we had a second person coding the data. And for the students, they really get to know what we are working on. And for, I by now, particularly with many of the politicians in Europe and in other places rejecting the value of science to society, I see the need, particular for a university, to also teach its graduates what are we doing, so to take this along and to have the value for society really embedded into what they learned at university. Sorry, this is really even a political, how to say, goal, aim, objective that I integrate into my job. Yeah, if not, we risk being vanished with a few signatures. That's what the strange orange guy now tries to do at the moment. Yeah, yeah, they have turned down websites globally and these kind of things. The National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Agency data is basically shut off from the US, and this is the backbone of all the climate modeling globally. Some people copied it somewhere else and tried to host it now somewhere else, these kind of things. So this is, and if the people that leave our universities with the master, which is after the PhD, the widest degree globally, the highest degree globally, which a lot of people do, and they have not understood what we are doing at universities, I'm back to theory and method, then I think we also fail on what we deliver to society. So that's why this is really, I think this is really a relevant point and of relevance. Back to the examples. So we take examples from either risky things that I picked up in the last half year, because we typically have this on a half-yearly cycle, or we directly, that's a bit the safer ones, are always with the students. Yeah, I sometimes also do safer things. That's not always that I'm only doing the risky fun. But let me just give one more example. In the last 3 terms now, I had students play with analyzing podcasts, taking podcasts as a natural interview situation, which you don't even have to create. Yeah. So the full transcripts of the podcasts are available, all the data is there, and it's really interesting. So I hope that by summer we have a first paper that we really can send in for peer review. And whether this would then work or not, never mind. I'm not, in this respect, I'm allowed to say I'm not worried for my career anymore. Yeah. Once more, PhD students, junior faculty is a different thing. I can look at this a bit easier. So that's where I'm talking about this right now already, defining research topics, typically this kind of things. And then we write a structured abstract ourselves. Typically in the abstract, what you find? You would find a theoretical foundation. We would specify the method that we try to be used, and we have a clear timeline. I'll illustrate the timeline a bit later in more details. We also introduced them just to show you into then how do they write. So they really get a deliberately introduction also into academic writing. And even a master thesis, typically by now, I prefer to have the length of an academic paper in our field. So the total master thesis typically should not be longer than 10,000 words. Yeah. Even some of you might have heard of the famous writer, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Yeah, many centuries ago. And Goethe is attributed to the saying, I wrote a long letter because I did not find the time to cut short. It's usually much harder to write 10,000 words than to write 50,000 words. Yeah, you have to precise. But if you, again, if I link this now to the real world, to the practical world, to the boards of the companies, to the CEO level, yeah, a CEO briefing will not allow you to write 50,000 words. If you are there allowed to write 10,000 words, then this is a lot already. Typically, we talk of 1,000 to 2,000, something like this. Yeah? So be realistic when our students go to the corporate world. They have to be short. They have to be precise. And that's what we try to train them on. Huh? So there's even the link. Most of you might be familiar with this. And again, it's a bit more for the social sciences and not so much the engineers. The engineers have typically a variation somewhere there, which, no, this is not what I wanted to have. So we have here the introduction. That's basically problem statement, these kind of things. What kind of what's the relevance, linking into theory, method, empirical field, just as mentioned. The conceptualization, you could also just call the theory section. I can here just, this doesn't work, then let's take another one. Yeah, this is you can also just write here the theory. Here it says method anyway. I showed this already. Results is basically the application of the method. So these two chapters clearly belong to each other. Yeah. Then the theory, the conceptualization, you have to say what do you add to this in the discussion section. And in the conclusion, you provide a brief answer to the introduction. Let's just keep it a bit short here on this side, but it's a typical logic on how you would have this linked. And again, the whole story, as this is also here called as storytelling, has to be running throughout the paper to have a compelling paper. Yeah. Now back to the process. We stepwise walk the students through the research process. And now we change the sequence a little on what they have to write. They start typically with writing an introduction. Then they submit the introduction and get feedback. Then we typically make them first to write the method section, because that's typically a bit clearer. And in the method section, you do typically use less references. You do not use the many references that you would have in the you would not use the many references that you have in the theory section. So they typically need to read this a little longer. And the method, therefore, is then typically a bit more straightforward. Again, they get some feedback on the method section. Then the literature reviews come in the theory section, again, submission feedback. Then in meanwhile, they should be working on, let's say, coding interviews, coding some other data, doing statistical analysis, whatever is appropriate for this particular thing. And then some feedback, and then they finally would submit the essay. So we walk them through this process. And by doing so, we are engaging with them. The challenge, let's be also straightforward. Typically, one of us cannot supervise more than, I would say, 4 or 5 groups in a term. And the group typically would consist of 2 or 3 students. So it limits on how many students you can do this with. If you have a very large class, I would certainly see challenges in rolling this out in a much larger setting. Let's just be also realistic on these kind of things, and teaching load, I guess, is an issue. Here's the timeline that I added to it, and that's what we typically provide the students with. So in the first week of the class, we would start with the academic writing with these 6 steps that I quickly introduced here. Then quickly they would have to decide on groups and distributing topics, because already 3 weeks later, they would have to write a first introduction. The first sections that they submit, we would typically only, let me carefully say, punish them if they do not submit on time. We basically, in the German logic, we try to avoid dropouts of students. Yeah, because that's what we earlier saw in seminars all them often. And this way, we try to make them work early and commit early. And once they have committed, once they have invested time, then they will continue. So if they drop out, then they should drop out basically latest by week 5, then they are gone. That's all good. Never mind. Because later on, then it always causes team trouble. While also we try to do this in teams, because in the corporate world later on, you would also work in a team. And now if you are in my situation, I can choose my team members, but a typical person working in the corporate world will not choose its team members. Yeah, and I was also multiple times of my work life, I was part of teams where I was subordinate and I did not choose the others next to me. So you have to work with others anyway. And that's also an exercise in its own right to integrate this into, you have to also work with others. Yeah. Here's another example. The first author, Lara, is here, but unfortunately she's not feeling well enough today. So otherwise we would have this done a bit together, because it's basically based on her master thesis research, which was basically developed in the same logic. Yeah? I showed it more for an essay, but we once more then do it rather as individual students having more time for the master thesis. Master thesis for us by now is equivalent to roughly half a year of work, half a year full-time work. I know that you have some master programs where it's even a full year. That would give you even more opportunities to do so. But for us, 6 months. So just to give you a timeline and an idea on how much we basically do so. Sorry, I have to again change my slide set. Let me just... So that's a presentation that is based on the paper, and I'll again, sorry, I have to share this again. Here we go. So let's start with the arguments here a little. Here the term bottom or base of the pyramid is used. You could also use emerging market environments, which is, I would say in a simplification, I can use this more or less the same, but it's basically doing with business with people which in a global income pyramid would be in the lower part. Yeah? And globally, we talk of billions of people of doing so. And what you see, and I think that holds if you go around in Sri Lanka, and the week before coming here, we just spent some days in Pakistan, you see as well, then even the not so affluent ones, by now they have a smartphone. And it's very simply based on the fact that a lot of the transactions is done based on smartphones. A simple one that you may have heard of, and I'm honestly not fully sure on how common this is in Sri Lanka by now, is that also that in some cases, people rather even have now a smartphone and sell and buy smartphone credit even instead of making bank transfers. Yeah, for the ones a bit better off, and for the ones that have bank accounts, that's the case. I don't know the figures for now Sri Lanka or so, but in Kenya and the east of Africa, we still talk of maximum 10% of the population having a normal bank account, but a large share of them really buying and selling smartphone credit as a transaction system. M-Pesa is one of these enabling tools and companies that basically do so. This was some of the initial observation. So that's basically a bit of the empirical field. Then we have supply chains as a kind of a more theory-driven thing. We have ICT, information and communication technology. All of us in the room here today will have a smartphone here. Yeah, come on. That's how I also have fun. So that's about it. And then we basically have to look at what do we do with this by now. As said, I'll try to make this not too long. So this is just some of the arguments that we have. Here are such pictures, I think, rather taken from Ghana. This is where Lara spent some time in there. And here you see difficulties in management, product and service flows as an observation. And surprisingly, and I think this was some of the motivation for us to go into this and why we saw this as relevant. Once more, many people in these countries by now having smartphones, but we had basically almost no papers in the supply chain domain looking at how they are integrated into the supply chains. And of course, they are part of supply chains. And we hardly had any explanations on what to do in looking at our supply chain transactions accordingly. Yeah. Uncertain, fast-changing business environments, poor infrastructure, these kind of things. Let me, as said, shortcut is a little here. We have still these things. I always, or not always, I sometimes say the smartphones enable the leapfrogging that Mao dreamed of. Yeah, Mao dreamed of bypassing the established technologies of the Western world and directly moving on to the next one. And even in China, we see this in Shanghai, the figures 10 years ago, I'm not sure what they are now, where that about 10 people, in China, the figures were that 10% of the population really had a landline telephone, but at this time, 70 or 80% already had a smartphone. And we see this also now with German students. The normal German student, many of them do not have a normal landline anymore. They might have a LAN connection or something like this, but at normal, nobody is exchanging landline phone numbers anymore. When did you last get a landline phone number? Yeah, I honestly, the only one calling us on the landline is my mom. And obviously she's a bit older than I am. Yeah, so these kind of things, and we see that this is then that can be linked. We here particular said then let's focus a little and we look at particularly the agricultural sector and rather smallholder farmers and what do they do with such technology. So then we came up with a bit of theoretical framing, which I quickly introduce here. We want to enable the supply chain to run. We have the emerging economy markets or base of the pyramid supply chains markets as context. We have ICT, information and communication technology as an enabler. And very simple, then we turn to transaction cost, which I will not introduce here further, but it's basically simply the definition is transaction cost is the cost of using a market. Nobel Prizes for Ronald Coase and Oliver E. Williamson, if I hopefully recall right, 2009. I would have to check the year, so never mind. But yeah, so prominent concept in this way. Now we look at the nature of flows here. That's what I introduced with the terminology on supply chains already, information, financial, physical flows. Here's some illustrations that we have there accordingly. Yeah, market information, like what prices do I get? Farmers all of a sudden can actually check the price and are not reliant on an agent anymore on is the agent telling me. The agent will always say, well, the price is low at the moment. You have to sell to me at the lowest price because I can only sell at a very bad price. Yeah, and that will hold for in India and in Sri Lanka, that will have held a couple of years even only ago in the same way. Then financial flows I just mentioned already with digital payments that can be simpler. There's micropayment schemes where you have very, very low fees for the transactions and the efficiency of the payment and these kind of things. Many of you might do the same as I did already yesterday in a restaurant. I just paid with the smartphone. Yeah, the NFC chip allows you to make payments and these kind of things. And I guess that's against what I see, that's also quite normal over here. And then at the end, only we would have the physical flows because the physical flows other than the other two before, that then now really leads real logistics. For a banana or for a coffee bean or for a cup of tea, the tea needs physical transport. Otherwise, I cannot have it for breakfast. Yeah, that's basically the logic. So we then specified it a little more. So ICT influences the flow categories. Transaction costs provide a bit of theoretical explanation, and then we look at supply chain activities. Yeah. So just to show you how we develop this, and I think that's basically where I just here you see then that we predominantly had then a multiple case study approach. We took it quite simple. That was also criticized a bit in the publication process. But at the end, they took it because we predominantly were just using secondary data. We did not even make an effort for primary data, but we thought on all of the apps and these kind of things. In the first step, we can basically look at what are the apps writing and what are the users communicating on these kind of things. Yeah, not going too much into further details here. Here's some of the examples. You see that we always combined an example from somewhere India and somewhere Africa. Africa is always a very wide term. Africa is absolutely huge. The focus was predominantly on countries where either Lara had been already or I had been already. So it was predominantly Kenya, Uganda, this in Eastern Africa, and Ghana and Western Africa, to simplify a little in this respect. And then we basically tried to look at what is here. The first one is just information flows here, weather information, market information, then knowledge, crop cultivation, harvesting as typical flows in linking this together. And some of the service providers were predominantly looking at these things. What does this address in theoretical elements? Now then uncertainty and the supply chain activities, then information sharing. Yeah, just to look at this. And now here again, Kenya and Eastern Africa. Now it's M-Pesa that I bypassed already, or Fino payment in India, which I have heard of, but beyond this, I do not know. Yeah, just as an example, and here now we have solutions more for banks, governments, even insurance services sometimes being sold this way now. Could be crop insurance, could be health insurance, such kind of things. And now we basically see that we have here then a bit more already the financial flows as an additional feature. And then in the interpretation on the theory side, uncertainty and frequency, and therefore typically elements of risk and reward sharing that we have there. Last example, then more the physical flows. Again, technology, internet and smartphone-based techniques. Agro dealers here handling orders, inputs, track inventory, distribution of goods, networks of internet kiosks in rural area to carry products and reduce physical distances and such things. And then here we basically see how they interact, really linking the farmers and the suppliers and the customers to each other. And therefore here then transaction specificity, integration of supply chain processes. So that's basically the interpretation that we basically were allowed to, or that we reached this way to understand it. Yeah. Let me shorten it to these points because I'm taking quite some time already. And I will have to, again, stop the sharing, go back to my initial presentation. Yeah, so I now it went back a couple of slides. Let me just go all the way forward. Where's my mouse gone now? Here we go. So I mentioned this now, just to show you, and I hope the bar is going away now in a second from the Zoom sharing, because there's actually a reference. And we at the end published this in IEEE Transactions on Engineering Management. So you see that it really led to jointly developing research that was successful also in the field. Looking at the context again, we have studies on the effectiveness of research-based teaching. We also see in our case that the students like this a lot. It prepares the student, if we do this as an essay already, really very much for what we then expect in the master thesis to happen. And they learn a bit less on the single techniques, but far more on the total research process, which we see at a much better transferable skill, which they then take along into their later work environment. Yeah? And we have very positive feedback on students' motivation and engagement. We have far less dropouts in our seminars since we introduced them. In the German system, students can show up in the first couple of weeks and then say, no, I don't like the class, I go somewhere else. That's a bit, which I don't mind. That's our system here. And it's fair enough that you do so. Challenges, time and resource requirements. So you typically have to limit what you do to what you can basically have done in about 4 to 5 months. At least that's the logic, that's our semester logic that we basically have. And we typically want to have them done by the end of one semester, because then when the next semester comes, they will have other duties. That's fair enough. Yeah. Resistance to change in teaching methods. Yeah, that's other colleagues inside our own university have challenged us a little. Is this the right way to do? Again, I'm allowed to say, once you become a full professor in Germany, that's just your choice. This is really nice, believe me. Yeah, and as long as it basically works, and as long as we have enough students, and at the moment we have definitely more than enough students all the time, then that's all good. On the other hand side, we have groups having internal issues. Let me also frankly mention that just in the term that is now going to an end, I had a group of 3, and by half time, all 3 of them said we want to continue, but not with each other. Yeah. So all of a sudden, instead of having to supervise 1 groups of 3, I had 3 individual supervisions, which was also changing. And it changes also the outcome, because if they aggregate this, then you get some more depths, well, then it is basically limits, which is another reason why we want them to work together. And they were so much struggling with each other that I did not feel I should force them to stay together. Yeah, just to, it's not, I'm not single-sided. I'm not selling something that is shiny only. Of course, there's also always the challenges and the other points that you have in this way. You could use a bit more interdisciplinary research projects. I know that some of our engineerings do so, and sometimes like the electrical engineers on certain technologies then also try to cooperate with other students. You have to find the time for mentoring and support of the students. So that is, it's definitely not less time than what you spend in a normal teaching classroom. Yeah, as a careful notion. It's still time that you need to spend. You have a bit more freedom in the individual groups. So that's particularly also, again, catering my situation. I'm getting away from being fixed on it must be, let's say, Wednesday morning or Friday morning or something like this. We then schedule a meeting when it fits my schedule and the student schedule as well. Yeah, but typically I long-standing in my team, we do this Wednesday mornings. This is normal. The students know it's always in the calendar. So that's the normal one. And I typically then have to have all the interactions with the individual groups Wednesday morning. That's the normal thing to do. Only if that would not work out for any particular reason, then we might go to something else. Yeah, active contributors to research, and that's what they like, even if it leads to, and let me re-emphasize this, if it leads to risky research, and if we have then things which do not work out. I can mention an example where we tried to look at gender issues in supply chains. We conducted 5 interviews, which I think for such a student exercise was really nice. We followed more inductive logic because I had no clue. And the 5 interviews were just next to each other. They basically had no overlap. Yeah, that happens. Just to also be clear, not everything that we do there leads to anything. And it's very, 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 let me emphasize this, very, very, very rare that I would see in the risky topics, that I would see something that would be worse to be communicated to the rest of the world. Typically, once more, it's a learning exercise for the student and for me. Yeah, just trying to help some ideas to focus some things. But I enjoyed. I like this way of teaching much more than standing in front of classes. And I can stand in front of classes, and my basic undergrad classes, you don't want to know how big they are. Yeah? Different thing. But let me, and that's why I have this as here the last point, research-based teaching as key to student development. That is what I see since we converted to change to this about 6 years ago by now. We learn more and the students learn more and better. And that's the key point. I talked much longer than I expected. Many thanks for, I think I skip here because the rest is just some repetitions. Takeaway, yeah, linking teaching to research and integrating teaching and research with each other, exploring new topics. I emphasize this, having an opportunity for risky research. Let me emphasize this. I think we need it and I love it. I love that I can explore questions where I do not know on whether the research question, and that's why I repeat the figure here, on whether this research question would ever deliver something. But if, once more, if we never do this, we are not challenging our learning and the student learning enough. Then we are staying too much in the safe side, and I think we do this too often. Yeah, enhancing student learning, creating a research culture, that's what the students take away, and fostering a research-driven university. And against all that I understood, the University of Moratuwa wants to be one. Many thanks for your attention. Looking forward to all your questions. If there's any questions from the online audience, I see a couple of people, or from the ones here in the room. Then if that's the other point, let's ease our mind. Yeah, if I've put so much things on you that you say it's enough now, then I don't mind. Yeah, it's because this you have to know, have to ask questions, or it's all good. Yes, please.
We take now one module, a syllabus, and now there are textbook knowledge that we get to teach.
Yeah.
Plus, the other way is research integrated teaching. Now, what do you see as a good ratio, composition for any given subject?
Right.
And what should be the ratio of research integration and the theory?
That's a good question. I would, rather than having a ratio, I would first of all put this into sequential logic. That's why I said I predominantly see this at the master level and not so much the bachelor's level. Yeah. For us, just to position, typically we have a 3 years bachelor and 2 years master. You quite often have 4 years bachelor. So then let's, in the total 5 years, because that's the same in you and our system, I would say predominantly I would see this in the last 2 years. The first years, and if I would know a much better system, then I would do it differently. And let me bypass our daughter is at the moment in the 3rd year of industrial engineering program, and she hates all the silly business classes with all the just learning vocabulary and terminology and in marketing and in management accounting, and she loves the engineering part much better because there's something that you actually get done. Yeah. So and in the bachelor, I would say towards the very end of the bachelor thesis, then we have a bit of an element of this, but there we have far less time. In our case, that's only 12 weeks. So we have to be really careful on how much can we give them. That's typically, they would typically not collect data. They might be given 10, 15 interviews, something like this, to analyze, to just already the theory is there, the method is there, even the interviews have been conducted, the interviews are there, just analyze them, help us in doing so. And that might be the element. But once more, for the introductory things and in a wider degree program, you would have them. And whether it's then the basics of logistics or production planning and scheduling system or something like this, I lack creativity on how to integrate research on this side. Yeah. So it's for me something predominantly once they have at least acquired some knowledge, some terminology, some readings already, and this kind of thing. So I would once more rather see it as a sequential issue than a ratio. But last 2 years in a 5-year program, that would predominantly where I would see this. And I see it really as a challenge because in an ideal world, and as I just mentioned, the one child finished his bachelor last September, and the next one is supposed to finish the bachelor this September. Yeah, so we are just in the process in the family, and we have multiple discussions on educational matters and purposes. And our son always envisioned a world where you would do individual projects with the students and these kind of things. And then I said to him, but it's basically doing a PhD with me for 3 to 4 years. But then my capacity is limited to supervising, let's say, somewhere around 5 PhD students. And I'm comparatively, I would say, experienced already. Yeah. So I could have 5 students. Now my first year class is 500. What can I do? The university will not multiply me 100 times. Yeah. To just do it this way. In an ideal world, of course, then education would look very much different. And you could, I think, if you could envision this, and I guess when we talk of a tiny bit of institutions like Oxford and Cambridge and MIT, where they have much better student staff ratios and resources and clever people and all of these kind of things, yeah, then you might integrate a bit more of these elements already into bachelor programs. But I guess that's hardly your situation, and it's definitely not my situation. Because we even universities are a resource constrained world. I mean, this is what all of economics and management is about, dealing with the resources that you have. Yeah, and the 500 is actually not a joke. This week Monday, we had my undergrad first year exam, and I'm not sure how many turned up because there's typically a couple of dropouts over the weekend. But last Thursday, the number of registered students was standing at 520. Which let me at least mention this, because I think this might be really a local issue here. So as bad as it is, but we try to save some resources, so to say, on the very front end, to have resources for the research intensive teaching that I outlined on the other end. If I multiply the first year class and put more resources in there, then it reduces my time that I have available for what I just illustrated. Yeah, so it's definitely also inside the institution. It's a trade-off in how much time and energy and effort do I spend on the first years. Let me also honestly mention, I don't do the marking, okay? I'm not marking this exam myself. Let's leave it like this, okay? Other things only not recorded. So you have to do this. But if you want to have also the time for research, then you need to also create an environment where this is actually possible. And if you always keep people busy with teaching, like this class is only 2 hours of contact time. Yeah, I have to teach in our environment. I have to teach 8 contact hours in a semester or 16 contact hours. If I would break the cohort down into, let's say, just still 100 students, yeah, then that would require that the teaching is done 5 times. That would be basically in a year, because in the summer it's usually a bit less. It's only about 300 students. In the winter, it's usually about 500 students. You would absorb all of my teaching just with this class, and I would do nothing at all ever in my whole teaching in the whole year. Now, to whose benefit would this be? I would be bored after 2 years. I would drop that. Yeah, and the students, would it be better for them? Whether you then have 100 or whether you have 500, as soon as you go beyond, I would say 30, where you really can personally interact, then it is front row teaching anyway. I just teach. Yeah, that's not perfect. That's also not good. I could envision a better world, but in a resource constrained world, I have to find a compromise on how much time and effort, also from the teacher side, from the lecturer side, I put on these things. And therefore, then I have free resources for the more research-driven environment. And I think this is a trade-off that many universities, and I have been to quite some places, so it's something that I do not only see in Moratuva, but I have seen this already in Croatia, just in the south of Europe. I have discussed the very same things in Thailand, which is a bit closer, but also in Brazil, which is a bit further away. Yeah. So you have to find a mode in balancing these requirements. And all of you are active staff members and active research staff in giving you the time and the resources to actually do some research. Otherwise, you are always trapped in textbook teaching, which once more, that's not wrong. Yeah, please, I'm not single-sided. The first 3 years, also in what my team is teaching, is basically textbook knowledge. And that's also a matter of efficiency. The first textbook I'm using in the first year, it's a German one, never mind, but it's coming from the Vienna University of Business and Economics. That's the largest exclusively business and economics university in Europe. They train roughly 5,000 students with this textbook every year. So if they can do 5,000 a year, I can do 500. Yeah, And let me also mention the relationships are so close. Whenever they do an update, I get the slides for free. Yeah, how much time do you, before you have a slide set for a first year class that is free of errors? Never mind, but really making sense, having a didactical approach, moving from one topic to another. Yeah, being free of errors. The first edition of the textbook that they had, we sent several emails to them pointing to errors. By now, fourth edition, that's it in now, more than 10 years later, it has really reached a decent level. And it is established things like some of you that have done some, it's the economic order quantity is in there, the trade-off on certain decisions is in their quality, is in their purchasing, is in their logistics, in their modal split and such things. That's all covered. It's rather broad than deep. It's a matter of choice that I made. I thought of I'm rather in the first year covering more broad issues and not going too deep into anything. That's a compromise either way. You could do it differently, never mind. But once more, you have to be aware of how much time, effort, resources you also put into such things. Certainly. And if you absorb all teaching in these things, then where should the research come from? And research is fun. Yeah? But it takes time. All of us in any kind of halfway senior role, and typically already when you start as lecturer, senior lecturer, something like this, you're giving so many administrative duties. I was the dean of the study programs in our faculty exactly 10 years ago. Responsibility for 6,000 to 7,000 registered students. At the time, 3,500 full-time equivalent students. There were emails coming to my mailbox where I had no clue on what program and what issue and what topic and these kind of things. Yeah, and so I'm aware that this is also part of an academic job, and I would say it's fair enough not to shy away, and every staff member should also be involved in such activities, but in a fair share. But once more, if we want to be research focused, if we want to have a chance to impact on society in a wider manner. And let me also be positive on this one, because quite often this is related to how much do you interact with companies. I don't mind if you find the time and if this is your interest, then that's all good on my side. I do not do too much on these things. Yeah. The strongest impact that we have on society, this is the graduates that we send into society, that take the things that they learned at university, the ability to abstract, the ability to ask questions, and asking questions once more can be equated with using theory, and the ability to answer questions, and that again can be equated with using method. Yeah, this is our impact on society, the strongest that we have. And the graduate that leaves, of course, in many cases would go from engineering, from business, would go to the corporate world, would have a managerial position, would impact on these things. But they are also a person going to the ballot for the election. They are also a person that will talk to other people in their environment, in their local environment on environmental and social issues. There are also people that impact society in a much wider way. They have the clubs that they go to, they have the local interactions with neighbors, and that is also part of our responsibility. Of course, it is also to educate leaders for industry, but it is educate leaders for society. And I see this as in an environment. We just had a general election in Germany last Sunday, and there's a share of the population where I question what education they have been to, yeah, against the vote that they casted. Let me carefully put it this way, yeah. And therefore I see this definitely as a part of our education and on our responsibility to society. This is why I'm paid on a public scheme, why I'm in a public funded university in doing so, yeah. And I clearly see this as part of my responsibility in the last 5 years, more than ever before in my job life. Any other comments? You're allowed to challenge me. I love to be challenged.
Very much for your presentation. It was very interesting, and I think we all have clearly seen your enthusiasm towards research-based teaching. So I would like to know how about the students, how is their response? Like what was their feedback with regard to research?
When we start with the class, yeah, many of our master students come from also more teaching intensive institutions. So they change university in between, which I like. That's good. Gives a different flavor. And if none of our bachelor students would ever go somewhere else, that would be a nightmare. Yeah. So that's absolutely. Yeah. But even the ones that come from more research intensive institutions, typically in their bachelor, they have not experienced too much, if I see this right. Lena's just nodding her head. She did her bachelor's at the Technical University of Berlin, which is a far more prominent institution than we are. Yeah, more people have heard about this one than ours. And so I think this is the challenge that you always have in the first, once more, 2 to 3 years. You have to introduce them to whatever subject you have and to the kind of topic. So in the first place, they are typically a bit not so sure, because it's so much deviating from what they had in the previous classes. And that's why we really make an effort over the first minimum 3 weeks in stepwise, not in 1 week, deliberately not in 1 week, and stepwise introducing them to the logic and almost repeating the argument 3 times. Yeah, in different manners, but the core things basically deliberately being repeated. So to transfer this, and then what typically helps, and I think always the groups that are directly supervised by me, they have it the hardest, because the rest of the team is typically much younger and much closer to the students. Yeah, I'm the old guy. Yeah, the others are typically sometimes same age as the students. Some students might even be older than the people supervising them. Yeah, if you have these kind of situations, typically they are mature enough that this does not create tensions anymore. For 18 years old, that would still be a challenge. For 25-year-old, they typically can accept this and can see it's driven by the knowledge and by the experience. And whenever one of my team members would come through a situation where they are not fully sure, they can definitely turn to me. And whether I then have the perfect solution or not, that's yet another question. Because sometimes I would say I'm there to have clear answers, and sometimes I would also say I'm there to add to confusion. Yeah, because let me positively reflect on this. Sometimes we have to be challenging to students and wait for 1, 2 weeks. Sometimes not too long. You don't want to frustrate them completely to run away. Yes, but having them also for PhD students, having them to go through a phase where not everything is clear, and particularly for a PhD student, if you would have never wanted to give up your PhD in your 4 years or 3 years, then the topic is not challenging enough. Yeah, please. My situation, never mind. Yeah, not any simpler on my side. Yeah, it's not that everything in life for me was completely easy. Yeah, I also had the ups and downs, which are part of this. So that's but once they accept it and once they are in it, then they might still have a bit of the trouble with the topic and with the things and these kind of things. And you might have to reassure them, particularly in challenging, risky topics, and what I mentioned several times now, you will get your credits, you will get your mark, and the mark is not based on you have to have a positive outcome, by no means. Yeah, but you're right, it's really an excellent question. It takes some time to talk them into this process, and we don't really monitor this. That might be interesting, but we typically also have dropouts after the first 2 or 3 weeks. We also have students that decide, I think that's what is typically in economics, that's called voting by defeat. They just do not show up anymore. Which is fair enough, I don't mind. Yeah, before they put themselves and us in trouble. And luckily also in our situation, typically they have more than one choice. And for all the students, some of them have to do a research methods class, but then there's also other people offer them as well. So only my basic supply chain management class that is compulsory for some master students, while all the other things is basically what you would call an elective. So they can do it with us. If they do it with us, then we have quite a share that wants to be supervised for the master's thesis, sometimes even too many. So once they've learned the process, then quite often they like it. But again, also we have also students that say after one term with us, that's a strange guy, I better go somewhere else. And again, I would say that's fair enough. Yeah. And I guess you already see this from what I'm doing here today. I have a certain style in my things. And I, particularly in my first year class, I always have a share of students that do not like my style. That's fair enough. Yeah. But for comments in the first year feedback, do I change everything? No. And that's not because I'm silly or something like this. Because if at least 80% are okay with it and enough, then you balance it. And I also have some that provide positive feedback. Yeah. I hope I at least could also partly carry across that I like my topics, that I like my subjects, and that I still like to go for challenging topics. Yeah. But right, it's fair enough. And it's you need to accept, let me repeat this, you need to take the first 3-4 weeks of the term to really guide students into this really different process, because it's really different from textbook teaching. Textbook teaching in the first year class, I know, in the first week, I always have the outline of the class and I say, this is the textbook. And then I see some students realize this is the textbook. I prefer to read the textbook at home instead of going to the class. On my side, that's perfect. That's all fine. Believe me, I had just as a personal anecdote, I had in chemistry, when studying chemistry, I had a professor using a strange accent from Switzerland. And this at 8 in the morning. Oh, no, I just could not go there. I read the book. Yeah, 8 in the morning. This was like torture. Yeah, and if you feel like this in my class, no, then please don't torture yourself. That's all fair enough. Yeah, and once more, it's predominantly electives, so they have other options. They should have other options. Else we would not be a sound university if on this level of education you would only have one option. That I think we restrict them enough already with certain things, and then they should have their choice. And let's also be straightforward now. I've also introduced a couple of supply chain issues, because that's basically what here the department does and what we are doing. And thereby also try to give you a bit of a content-related idea on what kind of things we are on. And I can clearly see that some students like the supply chain and understand that this has a relevance. Everybody of us here's a supply chain behind this, behind the tea there is a supply chain, behind the desk is a supply chain. You cannot run away of supply chains, but that you might not like it as an academic topic that you study, I can still understand. That's all fair enough. Yeah, I'm lost with linguistics. I listen to music a lot, but music theory, I have absolutely no idea. So that's all good on my side. And yeah, there's no big deal. But both questions, really, that's highly relevant.
So now when we speak about risky topics, so at the end of research, it's most likely to be like in order to publish some research output, there should like most of the journals, they accept success stories. But
right. No.
When we have a negative outcome, like how can we handle that? And how when we carry out research, we choose a really unorthodox topic and pursue for the perfect answer for that.
No, fair.
We will proceed, but at some point, if we cannot achieve that in the timeline, we might have to abandon that. So, how can we plan?
That's also a good point. Let me also specify this. So let's assume we would have 10 topics for the starting term. Then maximum 2 of them would be the risky ones. Yeah. So it's only a share. And that's, so we would typically have, like I showed you, Lara's work, that was her work for the master thesis. She then continued into a PhD, which she completed last September now. And then we basically went from more secondary research into collecting primary data. And the first set of primary data was interview-based. And then we had even a female master student staying 3 months in Lahore, Pakistan, for data collection from small shop holders, with the help, of course, of locals in Lahore, in different business environments, more affluent, less, and so to balance all of these kind of things. So we went from more. There was then also some conceptual research in between. So we had different research, and we tried to build this up over time. Yeah, and this is the more safe side, where we then engage students. So they helped in conducting interviews online. They helped in coding interviews and these kind of things. So that's more straightforward. Once more, so we would have, I would say, a maximum a fifth of the topics that we would offer would be risky things. And even when I started with Lara, that was also a bit more risky things. I had an idea, ICT in business environments in poor countries is relevant, but that was basically my observation. And whether the observation would then lead to a line of research that really works, or whether after one term we would have said, now this doesn't work, and you better move to something different, that can also help. Yeah. So once more, it's a balance. It's only a certain number of topics that you would have on this side, and most of the topics would rather be on continuing things where we see some things that they are already continuing interviews, like Lena has conducted interviews now already, and then coding interviews together with Lena, who's just sitting there, would be another option, and that's on the safe side. So it's not that 100% of the topics would be risky. Sorry, not to overemphasize this. So it's really only a share. And once more, it's typically the topics that I then do, because my career is, at the moment, I can take risk. I'm allowed to say in the German logic, I sometimes say in the German logic, my feet are in concrete. I cannot run away anymore. Yeah. And the position is quite safe. As long as I do not beat our president or something like this, I do not have a real risk on losing it. But it's also what I would see there is some need, particularly at public universities, once more to re-emphasize this, for having a certain degree of safety, to then also have the freedom of doing such research, which at the end is then warranting society in the mid to long run. And I showed you the more research-led teaching example that I used. I mentioned it was 15 years between publishing it, 4 years of timeline before it was published. We needed 3 journals to publish the paper. Yeah, I hope the other 2 regret by now that they have not accepted it. The editors might not remember and might not know anymore. Never mind. Yeah, but it took us 4 years before it was published, and then it took another 10, 15 years before it really made some impact. And in this respect, I typically ask for both our students as well as wider society to be patient with us. Many things that we deliver will not come to fruition within 6 months. We are not a corporate project running in a corporate manner. I'm not a consultant delivering outcomes in 3 weeks. No, I'm not. I don't want to. And please, I'm not saying that the consultant is a bad guy, he or she. No, not at all. They have their job, they have their responsibilities, they do their job, but I do my job. And my job is deliberately different from being a consultant. And again, I don't mind. I have colleagues in Kassel that are far more into the consulting side than I am. That's all good, because university lives on diversity. It would be a silly world, which I would hate, if everybody would do everything as I do it. That would be the most horrible world to think of ever. Yeah. I'm not one of these where we think it should be all the same. So back to your question, really, it's only a tiny share of the things. And I particularly try to use them to look at new topics, which I pick up something in the academic writing. At moment, I'm not sure on whether I would go there or not, but there's a new stream in the supply chain literature on so-called regenerative supply chains. So I have documented how much our supply chains harm the environment. Now, regenerative supply chains should be, let me simply put it, they should be so good that they heal the environment. I think reducing harm at the moment is typically what we look at, not having so much pesticides, not killing people, not having strong working hours until they would really do something positive, like regenerate our biodiversity and so on. Boa, I even find it very hard to see. I find it a really nice idea. It's been put forward in some of the academic writings at the moment. I really like the idea. We have not seen too much empirical research on these things yet. And that might be something where you might try to look at, maybe even to talk. We have an agricultural faculty to talk with people from agriculture. What practices would they have that really help soil to regenerate, to use something particular? And soil, of course, in cotton, but also in all the food that we have, is one of the core ingredients. Otherwise, our food supply chains would not work. Yeah, or the nice tea that you produce in Sri Lanka, you could not sell to the globe. Yeah, so that might just do. This is something where I'm, just to give you an idea, this is something where I'm on and off in my head at the moment, and sometimes I reach conclusions, and sometimes I do not reach conclusions. And sometimes, once more, I just give it a go. I mentioned this gender issue, and I was completely lost. Believe me, I was so lost. That was, I think, the case that once we really, I had five interviews for such a group of 2 students. That's really great, but it was complete nonsense because each interview talked of something different, which was all relevant. So I at least got some ideas of relevant topics in the area. Then that was more an issue on how other things develop. Sometimes I also do not find the immediate capacity to carry on some of these issues, while I would see the relevance of what is now called the diversity and inclusion. I'm sorry, I'm missing the E. Equity, sorry, thank you, Lena. Yeah, diversity, equity, inclusion logic in the supply chain research. Other people have, even a local colleague in Kassel, have written nicely on this topic. And it's, of course, we are also respectful, and I also try to show this in the presentation. It's definitely not our research only. We always have to look at what others are doing and what is developing at the same line, and what other contributions, because the body of knowledge, and particularly if you look back on the term theory, that typically lives on multiple people contributing multiple pieces of research. So to then develop something from a more conceptual level into a mid-range and maybe later on a grand theory level. Yeah. And the grand theory, even so that we, even in economics, I would see this, the grand theory level that is then rewarded with something like a Nobel Prize is typically also not coming together by only one person. That is then the same in medicine or in chemistry and the Nobel Prizes. There's typically multiple teams looking into the same direction, and then you reward the topic by picking some of the people. And I assume they typically make wise choices before they give Nobel Prizes. Yeah, and check this a lot. But it's typically not the one person doing it. It's the whole environment where it then culminates into some research that some people publish and then get a reward for this. But if others would never see your research as relevant, then you would also never get a Nobel Prize. I will not get one. I'm not worried. Yeah, that's all fine. But there is multiple issues that you can look at. And what I wanted to, and that was really on my agenda for this presentation, to emphasize and to also admit that I can mention more research topics that we looked at that did not work out. We tried to look early on biodiversity. That's by now already, I would say, almost 10 years ago. I had a student doing a master's thesis on this. And while I see the relevance of ecosystems for supply chains working, I fail still to understand on how would now the supply chain feed back into the ecosystem. Yeah. So what could supply chains actually, that links a bit into this regenerative idea, which I just sketched very briefly now. So there is also puzzles and challenges, but puzzles and challenges is typically a good starting point for doing research. If you fail to understand something, and if you do not, in a decent search of literature, not 5 minutes on ChatGPT, still do not see that something has been addressed. That was, I returned to this emerging economy and ICT. I thought, boy, somebody must have something written on this already because ICT is so prominent. Then emerging economies was a prominent scheme. Supply chain management, we had enough research, and we just talk of the paper was published 22, accepted 22. So about 5 years back when we started with this was hardly addressed. And I was rather perplexed by we searched Web of Science, we searched Scopus and other search engines, even Google Scholar, and we found very, very little. And then we thought, wow, that cannot be, because globally we are talking of supply chains that literally billions of people are working on every day and using their smartphones every day. And nobody is writing about this. Then that must be something strange. So of course you have to double check with is this relevant? Is this not relevant? Do we see a need for going there and be encouraged? That's what is the nice saying? The only perpetuum mobile that science has ever found is the discovery of new research questions. That's what you can always keep going. Shall we conclude it here? If there's an online question, then I don't mind. Else, thanks a lot for your patience. Thanks for listening to me for so long. Particularly in the introductory part, I took a bit longer than I expected myself. I enjoy being here. I enjoy the discussions with you, and I look forward to further interaction. Thanks a lot.
Okay, so I would like to thank Professor Stephan Suering for his wonderful presentation and the valuable insights of supply chain management and research integrated teaching. And to mark our appreciation, I now invite Professor Ruwan Gopura to present a souvenir to Professor Suering as a token of our gratitude.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Then let me also wave goodbye to the people online. Thanks for joining. Hope to see some of you in person. We are still here over the next days back for another event on the 5th of March. That's not here, but it's with the University of Moratuva. So I'm trying to promote whatever I can. Thank you.